She had a lot of friends but no very close companions, as most girls that age seem to have. She was extremely affectionate. She was perhaps more affectionate toward her parents than the average child, and the rest spilled out lavishly among the horses she knew, and among all other animals of her acquaintance indiscriminately. The Ferguson's horse, Perry, Jeanie rode a lot and fussed with a lot. Mary Ferguson was afraid of it, and Perry was not always completely sold on Mr. Ferguson. The result was that occasionally they could not catch their animal and had to come for Jeanie for help. Jeanie would walk out there in the pasture, and she would call with that serious grown-up manner of hers, "Perry, you've been a very bad boy. Now you come here this instant." And Perry would come. He'd trot over with a happy little whinny, and docilely allow that halter to be slipped over his head, though a few minutes before he had been galloping from one end of the pasture to the other with a great show of heels when anyone tried to approach him. This I saw with my own eyes. Why it was so I don't know, unless a horse has some way of knowing who loves him and who doesn't. She began going out to Helen Blair's when she was 10. Helen Blair lived a couple of miles outside town and owned a stable of riding horses. In the summer she furnished both horses and instructors to a girls' camp on the other side of the state. The rest of the year she gave lessons there at home. Trust Jeanie to find out about a set-up like that. The couple of times I'd been out there, the place had seemed to be infested with little girls feeding, currying, saddling horses, and riding endlessly around a ring, and looking at me with polite condescension when I asked what tack was and what posting meant. I gathered from Jeanie that to the little girls who liked riding horses it was like a club out there, and they adored Helen. When they didn't have money for a lesson they hung around anyways. Jeanie spent most of her time out there. Helen said that she spent hours just standing in the stalls brushing the horses, sometimes just talking to them. She took to getting up early and doing her hour of piano practice before school. She'd do her room work at noon, then after school she'd ride out to Helen's on her bicycle. In the evening she'd study and go to bed early so that she could get up for the practicing the next morning. I saw her out there once and complimented her on her riding. She thanked me carefully, but I watched her eyes. They were looking past me at two girls from town below who own their own little Morgans. If I ever read loneliness and longing in anyone's eyes, it was in hers then. When I turned away, I knew that with her, the riding, the lessons, the having other people's horses come to her was all very well, but there was a big lonely void that only having her own horse to love and fuss over could ever fill. I used to ask her once in a while how the horse fun was coming along. Sometimes she'd say, "Oh, pretty good," but sometimes she would tell me something definite, and I would know that she wanted to talk to someone about it. That was the way it was during the war, when she gave the $5 to the Red Cross. She said it didn't seem right that I should be keeping all this money when the Red Cross was giving plasma and things to soldiers. It didn't seem right. Yet you could sense the sacrifice it had been the major setback to her hopes. She gave to the Red Cross 3 times, and she bought war-saving stamps. But the stamps could go into the tin box, which was very heavy now. It was the same box that she had used right along, but now the Horse Moon had been crossed out, and over it written, in a little girl's hand, "Horse Money." By the time she was 13 she was official baby tender for the neighborhood. The money always went into the tin box. In a way it was too bad she liked ice cream and all kinds of sweets as much as she did, because if she didn't, saving would have been a lot easier. There must have been some pretty hard-fought battles behind that serious little face. But always the tin box won out. There was only 2 things that she would spend money on. One was movies which had horses in them, and she saw all of those, and riding lessons at Helen's. Mostly she was able to get her dad or her mother to pay for the riding lessons, but sometimes she could not, and then she very reluctantly tapped the fun. By that year she was 13, she had almost $100. That was the year she began to grow tall. She had been a chubby little thing earlier, but suddenly she began to shoot up, and all her hems were let out in a desperate effort to keep her properly clothed. I had expected she would be displeased at this sudden shooting upward, but I found her philosophical. "It must be easier to mount now, Uncle Red." The 14th year was when the pin-up boy appeared on her wall. "It made me feel old," Joe said. Here was my daughter starting to put up boy pictures. It made me feel darn peculiar. So when the time was right I said to her, "I was in your room today, Jeanie, and I noticed the Roy Rogers is your pin-up boy." And she said, "Oh, Daddy, that isn't Roy Rogers' picture. That's a picture of Trigger, his horse." That was the year she found out about an old Morgan that could be had for $125, and she hinted around to find out whether Joe and Mildred would lend her the extra $25 to buy it. That was a fairly tough decision on all concerned. Joe could have stood the 25 without any trouble, but the upkeep he just wasn't financially able to handle. By the time inflation in the United States was a healthy urchin and people with fixed salaries were pinched unmercifully under such conditions, Joe got a pencil and a piece of paper and he began to write down the things they would need. Jeanie had an old catalog and they looked up saddle, bridle, and probably other items which I know nothing about. Then he wrote down the everyday expenses that owning a horse would entail. There was stable rental, hay, oats, bran, shavings for bedding, pasture rental, and a lot of other items like that. He said that as he wrote, Jeanie's face grew more and more expressionless. The animation drained from it, and it became more stoical. They came to the conclusion that they would need at least $75 for equipment, which Jeanie called tack, and that it would cost about $100 a year, at a conservative estimate, to take care of the horse. Jeanie saw how impossible it was once the figures were down on paper. She thanked Joe for going over it with her, and excused herself. She didn't appear for a long time. They knew where she was well enough, and Joe said he and Mildred both felt horrible. Jeanie was older now and very seldom went away by herself any more, the way she used to. It had to be something out of the ordinary to make her do that now. I saw her a few days later and I asked her how the fun was coming. That was one of the times she told me something definite. She explained about the cost of upkeep and of tack and everything. She said a little wistfully, "Sometimes, Uncle Red, I get very discouraged. I guess I'm going to be an old lady before I get my horse. I guess it will be so late it won't do me much good." I said, "But you aren't going to give up, are you?" And she said, "No, I'm not going to give up." Her jaw seemed to stick out a little when she said it, though that might have been my imagination. That was the way things stood when the advertisement appeared in Horsemanship. As I have said, by that time everybody knew about Jeanie and her horse, and all of us were rooting for her. Two different people brought her the ad. Jeanie applied. It was a nice, straightforward letter with only a few misspelled words. Spelling had never been Jeanie's forte. The weakness in the letter lay in the fact that Jeanie could not describe either the stable or the pasture, but had to say that if the horse were given to her, she would have to look around and hire each of these items. After the letter went off, everyone concerned sat back and waited. I'd see Jeanie walking to school and back, and I could sense the tremendous excitement in her. She tried as always to hide any emotion she felt, but this was something out of the ordinary, so that I could see it in the way she skipped along, in the way her eyes sparkled, in every move she made. And my heart went out to her because I knew she couldn't win. I knew she couldn't because I was practical and figured the odds. They were many times 100 to 1 against her. She began to get together tack. She bought a pail to water the horse. She went down to the feed store and found out about Holtz and Bran. She canvassed the street nearest our development for a stable. She poked into old barns, carriage houses, stalls. Everything is new in our development, but on Middle Street, which is next to ours, the houses have been there, many of them, for over 100 years. Some of them have large barns and stables. She finally landed one of these. Then she went looking for a pasture. She spent 2 or 3 days on this. She had trouble finding one near enough to the stable, but she stuck to it in her grave, polite little way, and finally she succeeded. You went into her room and you found lists of horsey things she'd have to buy. The mail contained at least one catalog for her every day. You watched the excitement in her, and your heart went out to her because you knew that she was building up to a disappointment which would shake her through and through, which would hurt her worse than she had ever been hurt in her life. You could sense that. You wished there was some way you could protect her, and you could help her, yet you knew of nothing anyone could do. When people talked to me downtown, I found myself sticking up for her. One man said to me, "That is the luckiest thing I ever heard of, sitting back and having a horse turned over to you."